Sometimes life gives you a second chance to make things right, even when it feels too late. Clara Boone was alone in the world, carrying her late husband's child and fighting to survive each day. When she collapsed on the dusty streets of Dustwater, most people just stood there watching. But Silas McGraw, the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties, didn't hesitate. He dropped everything to save her life. What the town didn't know was that Clara's husband had died saving Silas years before. Now Silas had found the widow he'd been searching for. He opened his ranch to Clara and promised to raise her child as his own. But would she accept help from the man whose life cost her everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered planks of Dustwater's main street as Clara Boone adjusted the black shawl around her shoulders. At 23, she carried herself with the careful dignity of someone who had learned too young that life could change in a heartbeat. Her rounded belly, 6 months heavy with child, pressed against the simple cotton dress she'd let out twice already. The wedding ring on her finger caught the light, a thin band of gold that Thomas had saved for months to buy, working double shifts at the livery stable before their wedding day. Clara's small cabin sat at the edge of town, where the dust met the scrubland and the sounds of civilization faded into the whisper of prairie grass. Inside, Thomas's presence lingered in every corner. His riding spurs hung on a wooden peg by the door, the silver rowels still bearing traces of red dirt from his last cattle drive. She'd polished them every Sunday since he died, keeping them bright as the day he'd strapped them on for the final time. The cabin held barely 3 rooms, a kitchen with a cast-iron stove, a bedroom where she slept alone now, and a sitting area where Thomas used to read aloud from the newspaper while she mended clothes. His voice had been warm and steady, painting pictures of the wider world beyond Dustwater's borders. He'd spoken of buying land someday, building a proper ranch where they could raise their children and grow old together, watching sunsets from their own front porch. 8 months had passed since the telegram arrived with news of the stampede. 8 months since Sheriff Morrison knocked on her door with his hat in his hands, and that look in his eyes that told her everything before he spoke a word. Thomas had died on the Cimarron River crossing, trampled trying to save another man's life. The details had been sparse, something about lightning spooking the cattle, men scattered in the darkness, and her husband's body found at dawn beneath a tangle of horns and hooves. The grief had been immediate and total, like falling into a well and discovering there was no bottom. But grief was a luxury Clara couldn't afford for long. The baby growing inside her demanded food, shelter, and hope for tomorrow. Thomas's savings had covered the funeral and 2 months of expenses, but after that she'd been on her own. Mrs. Henderson at the general store had offered her work stocking shelves, helping customers, keeping the books in her careful handwriting. The pay was modest but steady, enough to keep food on her table and lamp oil burning through the long evenings. Clara was grateful for the work, though she noticed how some folks in town looked at her with pity mixed with uncertainty, as if tragedy might be catching. Dustwater itself was a town that had seen better days. The railroad had bypassed them 5 years back, taking with it the promise of growth and prosperity. What remained was a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a main street that filled with dust when the wind blew and mud when the rains came. The Lucky Dollar Saloon anchored one end of town, while the church stood sentinel at the other, a neat metaphor for the choices that faced every soul between them. The McGraw Ranch lay 15 miles north of town, sprawling across some of the finest grazing land in 3 counties. Silas McGraw had built his fortune methodically, buying up struggling homesteads during the hard years and turning them into a cattle empire. At 45, he was known as a fair but demanding employer, a man who paid his hands well but expected honest work in return. He lived alone in a grand house that local gossip said was too big for one man. Though none dared suggest he should marry, Silas McGraw's personal business was his own. Clara had seen him in town perhaps a dozen times in the years since she'd arrived as Thomas's bride. He was tall and spare, with grey threading through dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. He dressed well but not flashy. Good boots, clean shirts, a hat that had been expensive when new but showed the wear of actual use. When he spoke, which wasn't often in public, his voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. The townspeople treated Silas with the careful respect reserved for those who held economic power over their lives. He owned the bank, the lumber mill, and substantial shares in most of the businesses that kept Dustwater functioning. Yet for all his wealth and influence, he seemed oddly isolated, a man who moved through the world with purpose but little apparent joy. Clara's pregnancy had been difficult from the start. Without Thomas's steady income, she couldn't afford Dr. Morrison's fees for regular checkups. She'd been making do with advice from Mrs. Patterson, the midwife who delivered half the babies in Dustwater over the past 30 years. But Mrs. Patterson's wisdom, valuable as it was, couldn't address the deeper concerns that kept Clara awake at night, the sharp pains in her back, the dizzy spells that came without warning, the persistent exhaustion that seemed to worsen rather than improve as the months passed. Her morning routine had become a careful negotiation with her changing body. She'd rise before dawn, when the air was cool and her strength was at its peak. A breakfast of eggs and toast when she could keep food down, followed by the walk to Henderson's general store. The walk grew longer each day, not in distance, but in the effort required to complete it. This particular Thursday morning felt different from the start. The heat arrived early, pressing down on the town like a heavy blanket even before the sun cleared the eastern hills. Clara's dress, already snug across her expanding middle, felt suffocating in the still air. She'd forced down half a piece of bread and a cup of weak tea before giving up on breakfast entirely. The baby had been restless all night, pressing against her ribs and making sleep impossible. She'd paced the small cabin, her hand pressed to the small of her back, wondering how she would manage the months ahead. The money from her job barely covered rent and basic necessities. There was nothing left for unexpected expenses, like doctor bills or complications with the birth. As she prepared to leave for work, Clara caught sight of herself in the small mirror above her washstand. Her face had grown thin despite her expanding belly, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. She looked older than her 23 years, marked by loss and struggle in ways that couldn't be hidden with powder or rouge. Thomas's spurs caught the morning light as she passed them, and she paused to touch the silver gently. He would have known what to do. Thomas had possessed a quiet confidence that made problems seem manageable. He would have found a way to provide for his family, would have ensured she received proper medical care, would have been there to hold her hand when fear threatened to overwhelm her completely. But Thomas was gone, and Clara faced the uncertain future alone. She pulled the black shawl tighter around her shoulders, lifted her chin with the determination that had carried her through 8 months of widowhood, and stepped out into the gathering heat of what would prove to be a day that changed everything. The street was already busy with the early morning bustle of a working town. Wagons rolled past, carrying supplies to outlying ranches. Cowboys who'd ridden in for supplies tethered their horses outside the saloon and general store. Children ran errands for their mothers, kicking up small clouds of dust as they raced between buildings. Clara moved carefully through the familiar chaos, one hand pressed to her back, the other holding her shawl in place against the morning breeze. She nodded politely to neighbors and acquaintances, maintaining the dignified composure that had become her armor against the world's pity and her own desperation. She had no way of knowing that this ordinary Thursday morning would bring her face to face with the man whose life had cost her husband's, or that the collision of their separate sorrows would create something neither of them had dared hope for, a second chance at the family both had lost. Clara had made it perhaps 50 yards down Main Street when the world began to tilt sideways. The wooden boardwalk beneath her feet seemed to shift and sway like the deck of a ship in rough water. She pressed one hand against the rough-hewn post, supporting the barbershop's awning, fighting off the wave of dizziness that threatened to buckle her knees. The morning heat had intensified dramatically, turning the air thick and oppressive. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the early hour, and her heart hammered against her ribs with an irregular rhythm that sent spikes of panic through her chest. The baby pressed hard against her diaphragm, making each breath a conscious effort. "Mrs. Boone," old Pete Jameson called from his position outside the feed store, "you feeling poorly this morning?" Clara tried to answer, to offer some reassuring word that would prevent a scene, but the words wouldn't come. Her vision had begun to narrow at the edges, dark spots dancing before her eyes like summer gnats. The hand pressed to the post was the only thing keeping her upright, and she could feel even that tenuous grip weakening. The collapse came suddenly. One moment she was standing, fighting the gathering darkness, and the next she was falling toward the weathered boards of the sidewalk. She had time for a single thought: protect the baby, before consciousness slipped away entirely. Silas McGraw had been conducting business at the bank when he heard the commotion outside. Through the window, he could see a small crowd gathering near Henderson's store, their voices rising in that particular tone of excitement mixed with concern that signaled trouble. He excused himself from his conversation with the bank president and stepped out onto the street. The sight that greeted him stopped him cold. A young woman in black lay crumpled on the boardwalk, her dark hair spilled across the boards like ink on paper. Even from a distance, he could see the swell of pregnancy beneath her simple dress. The gathering crowd stood in a rough circle around her, voices overlapping in confusion and alarm. "Someone get Doc Morrison. Is she breathing? Poor thing's probably just the heat." Silas was moving before conscious thought took hold, his long strides carrying him through the cluster of onlookers. Years of managing ranch emergencies had taught him that decisive action often meant the difference between life and death. He dropped to one knee beside the unconscious woman, his experienced hands checking for pulse and breathing with practiced efficiency. Her pulse was rapid and thready, her breathing shallow but steady. Pregnant women were particularly vulnerable to heat stroke and exhaustion. He'd seen it happen before among the wives of his ranch hands. But there was something else here, something in the pallor of her skin and the dark shadows under her eyes that spoke of more than simple overheating. "Give her some room to breathe," he commanded, and the crowd instinctively stepped back. Silas had the kind of voice that expected obedience and usually received it. He shrugged out of his coat and folded it into a makeshift pillow, easing it under the woman's head with surprising gentleness. It was then that he caught sight of her left hand, and his world lurched as surely as if he'd been thrown from a horse. The simple gold band on her ring finger caught the morning light, but it was the way she wore it, twisted slightly to the right, a habit born of nervous fingers that sent recognition crashing through him like a physical blow. He'd seen that ring before, had heard it described in loving detail during long evenings around a campfire on the trail. Thomas Boone had talked about that ring constantly during their cattle drive, how he'd saved for 6 months to buy it, how it had been his grandmother's gold, melted down and reformed by the jeweler in Abilene, how Clara had cried when he'd slipped it on her finger. This was Clara Boone, Thomas's Clara, the widow he'd been searching for since that terrible night on the Cimarron River. Dr. Morrison arrived at a trot, his black medical bag clutched in his weathered hand. At 72, he moved with the careful urgency of a man whose body was no longer equal to his determination. He knelt on Clara's other side, opening the worn leather bag that had served Dustwater's medical needs for nearly 4 decades. "Mrs. Boone," he murmured, checking her pulse with fingers that had delivered babies, set bones, and closed the eyes of the dying for more years than most folks had been alive. Heat exhaustion, most likely. "Silas, help me get her into the shade." Together, they lifted Clara carefully and carried her to the bench under the awning of Henderson's store. "Doctor." Morrison produced a small vial of smelling salts from his bag, waving it gently under her nose until she stirred with a soft moan. Clara's eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding their brown depths as she struggled to orient herself. The first face she focused on was Silas's, and something flickered in her expression, not recognition exactly, but awareness that this was not just any good Samaritan who had come to her aid. "Easy now," Dr. Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of practice. "You've had a spell, Mrs. Boone. The heat got to you." Clara tried to sit up, then thought better of it as the world swayed around her. "The baby," she whispered, her hand moving instinctively to her belly. "The baby's fine," Dr. Morrison assured her, though Silas noticed the physician's expression carried more concern than his words suggested. "But I'd like to examine you properly. When did you last eat a full meal?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Clara's cheeks flushed with embarrassment that was clearly visible despite her pale complexion. "I had breakfast this morning," she said, but the defensive tone suggested it had been a meager affair. Dr. Morrison's examination was thorough but discreet. Conducted behind the screen he'd had Silas positioned to provide privacy. His findings were troubling. Clara's blood pressure was elevated, her reflexes sluggish, and she showed clear signs of malnutrition despite her pregnancy. The baby's heartbeat was strong, but the mother's condition posed serious risks for both of them. "Mrs. Boone," he said carefully when the examination was complete, "I'm concerned about your health. You need proper nutrition, regular medical supervision, and bed rest. The stress you're under isn't good for you or the child." Clara's laugh held no humor. "Doctor, I appreciate your concern, but I can't afford proper nutrition or bed rest. I have rent to pay and a job to keep if I want to eat at all." Dr. Morrison glanced at Silas, who had been standing quietly nearby throughout the examination. The two men had known each other for years, and a wealth of communication passed between them in that single look. "Mrs. Boone," Silas said carefully, "perhaps we could discuss some arrangements." "I don't accept charity, Mr. McGraw," Clara interrupted, steel entering her voice despite her weakened condition. "I've managed this long on my own." "But you haven't managed," Dr. Morrison said bluntly. "You collapsed in the street, and you're showing signs of serious complications. If you continue as you are, you could lose the baby. You might lose your own life." The words hit Clara like physical blows. She closed her eyes, her hand pressed to her belly where Thomas's child grew. When she opened them again, tears had gathered but didn't fall. "What exactly are you suggesting?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Morrison looked to Silas again. This was delicate territory. Clara's pride was as real a barrier as her poverty, and mishandling the situation could drive her away from the help she desperately needed. "Proper medical care, to start," Silas said. "Regular examinations, appropriate medications, and nutritious food. The details can be worked out privately." Clara studied his face, searching for something she couldn't quite name. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Silas felt the weight of Thomas's memory pressing against his chest like a physical burden. The truth sat on his tongue, ready to spill out that he knew her better than she could imagine, that her husband had died saving his life, that he'd been searching for her for months. But the words wouldn't come. Not here, not like this, with half the town watching from a respectful distance. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally, "and because no woman should face what you're facing alone." Clara was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on something only she could see. Finally, she nodded once, a sharp jerk of her head that spoke of decision made despite reservations. "I'll consider it," she said, "but I won't be anyone's charity case. If you help me, it's a loan. Every penny will be repaid." Silas nodded gravely. "Of course." But even as he agreed to her terms, he knew the debt between them ran far deeper than money could ever address. Thomas Boone had died to save his life, and now Thomas's widow and unborn child needed saving in turn. The circle was closing, and Silas found himself at its center, holding the power to honor his friend's sacrifice or fail him one final time. 3 days after Clara's collapse, Silas McGraw sat alone in his study as evening shadows gathered outside the tall windows. The room reflected the man who occupied it, practical, well-appointed, but somehow hollow, despite its obvious quality. Leather-bound books lined the shelves, though most remained unread. A grandfather clock in the corner marked time with mechanical precision, its steady ticking the only sound in the oppressive quiet. Silas opened the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk with deliberate care. Beneath a stack of cattle contracts and bank documents lay a folded piece of newsprint, yellowed at the edges from handling. He unfolded it with the reverence one might show a sacred text, though the content brought him no peace. The Dustwater Gazette, dated 9 months ago. The obituary section took up barely half a column. Death was common enough on the frontier that it rarely warranted extensive coverage. But one entry had been circled in pencil, read and reread until Silas could recite it from memory. Thomas Michael Boone, aged 26, died in service during a cattle drive on the Cimarron River, survived by his beloved wife Clara and unborn child. Thomas was known for his integrity, kindness, and devotion to family. Services held at Dustwater Methodist Church. In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to support his widow. Silas had clipped that obituary the day after receiving the telegram about the stampede. For months afterward, he'd carried it in his vest pocket like a talisman of guilt, pulling it out to read whenever the weight of his survival threatened to grow bearable. Eventually, he'd moved it to his desk drawer. But the words remained burned into his memory. The newspaper had provided Clara's name, but little else. Dustwater was 200 miles from where the drive had ended, and by the time Silas had healed enough from his injuries to travel, she'd vanished like smoke. No forwarding address, no family connections he could trace. It was as if Thomas Boone's widow had simply ceased to exist. But Silas had never stopped looking. He'd hired investigators in 3 states, placed advertisements in newspapers across the territory, even consulted with the territorial marshal's office about tracking down families of deceased drovers. All of it had led nowhere until 3 days ago, when fate delivered Clara Boone directly into his hands on a dusty street in the one place he'd never thought to search, the very town where her husband was buried. The irony wasn't lost on him. For months, he'd been riding past the Dustwater Cemetery on his weekly trips to town, never knowing that Thomas lay beneath one of those weathered headstones, never knowing that the woman he sought was struggling to survive mere miles from his own front door. Now he faced a dilemma that kept him awake long into the night. Clara had accepted his offer of medical assistance, but only as a loan to be repaid. She had no idea that her husband had died, saving the life of the man now offering help. She didn't know that Silas McGraw carried a debt that could never be settled with money, a debt written in Thomas Boone's blood on the muddy banks of the Cimarron River. The memory of that night remained vivid, despite Silas's efforts to bury it. He could still feel the crushing weight of the steer across his chest, still taste the metallic fear as hoofbeats thundered around him in the darkness. Lightning had turned the night into a series of frozen moments, cattle eyes rolling white with terror, men shouting orders lost in the wind, the river running black and swift beneath the storm. Silas closed his eyes and let himself remember Thomas as he'd been in life rather than death. The young cowhand had joined the drive in Abilene, one of 15 men hired for the long push to market in Kansas City. While the other drovers had spent their evenings drinking or gambling, Thomas had often sought out Silas by the campfire, asking questions about cattle management, land acquisition, and the business side of ranching. "I've got plans, Mr. McGraw," Thomas had said one evening, his earnest young face animated by firelight. "Going to save enough money to buy my own spread someday. Nothing fancy, just enough land to run a few head and build a house for Clara and our children." Thomas had spoken of Clara constantly, his love for her evident in every word. She was beautiful, he'd said, but more than that, she was strong, intelligent, capable of managing a household and handling whatever challenges frontier life might bring. He'd described her laugh, Her way of humming while she worked, how she could make a feast from ingredients that would defeat most women. "She's going to have my baby," Thomas had confided during their last conversation, the night before the river crossing. "Found out just before I left for this drive. I'm going to ask you for a loan when we get back, if you're willing. Nothing I can't pay back with honest work, but enough to get us started proper." Silas had promised to consider it, though in truth he'd already decided to help the young man. Thomas possessed the kind of integrity that was rare in any age, the sort of character that built successful ranches and strong communities. Investing in Thomas Boone would have been both good business and the right thing to do. But Thomas had never made it home to ask for that loan. He died in the mud of the Cimarron, crushed beneath panicked cattle while pulling Silas to safety. The last words he'd spoken were about Clara, a desperate plea for Silas to find her if something happened, to make sure she was provided for. Silas had given his word in that moment, shouting over the thunder and the bellowing of frightened cattle. It had seemed like an easy promise to make. He was wealthy, she was alone, and surely simple charity could discharge his obligation to a dead friend. He'd never imagined how difficult it would be to locate one woman in the vastness of the frontier, or how impossible it would prove to offer help to someone who viewed charity as a threat to her dignity. Now Clara was carrying Thomas's child and living in poverty that threatened both their lives. She worked at a job that barely provided survival wages, lived in a cabin that was little better than a shack, and faced the prospect of childbirth without adequate medical care. Meanwhile, Silas rattled around in a house built for a family, with money enough to solve her problems 10 times over. The solution seemed obvious, but Clara's pride stood between them like a fortress wall. She'd agreed to accept medical assistance as a loan, but Silas could see the suspicion in her eyes whenever they spoke. She sensed there was more to his offer than simple Christian charity, and her wariness grew with each interaction. "Doctor." Morrison had examined her twice since the collapse, reporting privately to Silas about her condition. The news wasn't encouraging. Clara was malnourished, anemic, and showing early signs of pregnancy complications that could prove dangerous if left untreated. She needed rest, proper food, and constant medical supervision, luxuries she couldn't afford on a store clerk's wages. "She's a proud woman," the doctor had warned. "Push too hard, and she'll bolt rather than accept help. But if we don't intervene soon, we could lose both mother and child." The weight of that warning pressed against Silas's chest as he refolded the obituary and returned it to his desk drawer. Thomas had died to save his life, and now Thomas's widow and child faced death because Silas couldn't find a way past her pride to offer the help they desperately needed. Somewhere in the growing darkness outside his study windows, Clara Boone was probably preparing for bed in her tiny cabin, unaware that the man whose medical bills she was so concerned about repaying had already received far more from her family than money could ever balance. The debt between them was written in blood and sacrifice, and Silas was beginning to understand that it might take more than wealth to honor it properly. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, marking another day's passage in his solitary existence. Tomorrow, he would find a way to bridge the gap between Clara's need and her pride. He had to, because failing her would mean failing Thomas, and that was a burden his conscience could no longer bear. The gold pocket watch lay heavy in Silas's palm, its ornate case reflecting the lamplight in his study. He'd carried this timepiece for 20 years, a gift from his father when he'd first taken over management of the ranch. It had kept perfect time through cattle drives, business meetings, and the countless moments that marked a man's passage through life. But for the past 9 months, it had been silent, frozen at 11:47, the exact moment Thomas Boone had drawn his last breath. Silas could have had it repaired easily enough. The clockmaker in Dustwater was skilled, and the mechanism was merely stuck, not broken. But something in him resisted the idea of letting time move forward again, as if the stopped watch was the only honest thing in his possession, a constant reminder that while his own life continued, Thomas's had ended in those dark minutes by the Cimarron River. The memory came flooding back with perfect clarity, as it had every night since Clara's collapse. The storm had built throughout the afternoon, great towers of black cloud marching across the Kansas plains like an advancing army. Silas had wanted to wait for morning to attempt the river crossing, but they were already behind schedule, and the cattle were growing restless in the humid air that preceded the storm. "We'll take them across in small groups," Silas had decided, studying the swift water that had risen since their last scouting. "Keep them calm and move them steady. Once the lightning starts, we'll have hell to pay if we're caught in the open." The first two groups had crossed without incident, but as the third bunch of cattle entered the water, the storm broke with biblical fury. Lightning split the sky in jagged lines, thunder rolling across the plains like cannon fire. The cattle, already nervous from the day's heat, panicked completely. Silas had been mounted on his best horse, a steady gelding that had never failed him in 20 years of ranch work. But even the most reliable horse was no match for 1,000 pounds of terrified steer when it decided to charge. The collision had come from his blind side. A massive longhorn bull, eyes rolling white with fear, had slammed into horse and rider with the force of a locomotive. Silas remembered the sensation of falling, the cold shock of river water closing over his head, and then the crushing weight across his chest as his horse went down. The gelding had broken its neck in the fall, pinning Silas beneath its body in the shallow water at the river's edge. He'd struggled to free himself, but the angle was wrong, and the dead weight of the horse held him fast. The cattle were streaming past him in the darkness, their hooves churning the riverbank into treacherous mud. Through the lightning flashes, he could see his men trying to regain control of the herd, but they were fighting a losing battle against panic and storm. It was then that he'd seen Thomas Boone riding hard through the chaos, his young face grim with determination. "Mr. McGraw!" Thomas had shouted over the thunder, throwing himself from his saddle even as his horse danced nervously at the water's edge. "Hold on, sir." What followed had been a desperate struggle against time and physics. Thomas had waded into the rushing water, bracing himself against the current as he tried to lever the dead horse off Silas's trapped legs. The young cowhand was strong, but not strong enough to move 800 pounds of dead weight alone. "Leave me," Silas had gasped, feeling the cold creeping through his body and knowing that Thomas was risking his own life in the attempt. "Get yourself to safety." "No, sir," Thomas had replied with the quiet stubbornness that Silas had come to admire. "I'm not leaving you here." The cattle were still running, their panic uncontrolled as lightning continued to split the night sky. Thomas had worked frantically, using a fallen branch as a lever, inch by agonizing inch freeing Silas from the trap. When the horse finally shifted enough for Silas to pull his legs free, both men were gasping from exhaustion and cold. "Can you stand?" Thomas had asked, his arms supporting Silas as feeling returned to his legs in needles of pain. Silas had tried, but his right leg wouldn't bear weight. Later examination would reveal a fracture that would keep him laid up for months. Thomas had half carried him toward higher ground, away from the treacherous riverbank where the cattle continued their wild run. They were perhaps 10 feet from safety when the final group of steers broke from the herd controllers and charged directly toward them. In the lightning's glare, Silas could see the terror in the animals' eyes, the foam on their muzzles, the deadly sweep of horns that could gut a man as easily as a butcher's knife. Thomas had seen them too. Without hesitation, he'd pushed Silas toward a large boulder that offered protection, then turned to face the oncoming cattle. He'd waved his hat, shouted, tried desperately to turn the animals away from their path. For a moment, it seemed he might succeed. The lead steer veered slightly, and the others began to follow. But a lightning strike, closer than any before, had sent the entire group into renewed frenzy. They'd charged straight through Thomas's position, trampling him underfoot in their blind panic. Silas had watched in horror as the young man disappeared beneath the surge of bodies, his final cry lost in the thunder and the bellowing of frightened cattle. When the animals had passed and the other drovers finally reached them, Thomas was already beyond help. He'd lived long enough to speak a few words, a desperate plea for Silas to find Clara, to make sure she was cared for, but life had left him quickly after that. Silas's pocket watch, somehow torn from its chain in the struggle, had been found beside Thomas's body, stopped forever at the moment of his death. The remaining drovers had wanted to bury Thomas where he fell, but Silas had insisted on bringing the body back to Dustwater for proper burial in the town cemetery. It had taken 3 extra days, but it was the least he could do for a man who died saving his life. He'd paid for the funeral, the headstone, and the obituary notice, all while laid up with his broken leg and unable to attend the service himself. By the time he'd healed enough to travel, Clara had vanished from Dustwater. The cabin she'd shared with Thomas stood empty, her few possessions gone, no forwarding address left with neighbors or landlord. For months afterward, Silas had hired investigators and placed advertisements, all to no avail. Clara Boone had disappeared as completely as if the earth had swallowed her whole. Now she was back, carrying Thomas's child, and struggling to survive on her own pride and a store clerk's wages. She had no idea that the man offering to pay her medical bills carried her husband's death on his conscience, or that Thomas's final words had been a plea for her welfare. She saw only a wealthy rancher offering charity, and her independence rebelled against accepting it. Silas closed the watch and slipped it back into his vest pocket. Tomorrow he would find a way to tell Clara the truth about Thomas's death and his own debt to her family. She deserved to know that her husband had died a hero, and that the help being offered came not from pity, but from a profound sense of obligation. The question was whether the truth would bring them together or drive them irreparably apart. Thomas had trusted him to care for Clara, but Silas was beginning to understand that honoring that trust might require more than money. It might require revealing the painful truth that connected their lives forever. Clara sat at her small kitchen table, the worn recipe book open before her like a treasured manuscript. The pages were yellowed with age and splattered with evidence of countless meals prepared with love, flour smudges, faded ink stains, and the occasional burn mark from being too close to a hot stove. Her mother's careful handwriting filled each page, recording not just ingredients and measurements, but memories of family gatherings, special occasions, and the simple daily rituals that had made their house a home. Apple butter cake for Thomas's homecoming. Read one notation in the margin. Clara's favorite molasses cookies make double batch for church social. Each entry told a story, connecting Clara to a past when her world had been full of people who loved her, and meals shared around tables crowded with family and friends. She traced her finger along a recipe for beef stew, remembering how her mother had insisted that the secret was in browning the meat properly and adding just a pinch of cinnamon to bring out the flavors. Clara had planned to make this stew for Thomas when he returned from his cattle driver celebration meal to welcome him home and share the news about their coming child. Instead, she'd made it alone on the night after his funeral, choking down every bite through tears that wouldn't stop falling. Dr. Morrison had visited again that morning, his second examination since her collapse on Main Street. His findings had been troubling, though he'd tried to soften the news with his usual bedside manner. Clara's blood pressure remained elevated, her weight was dangerously low for a woman 6 months pregnant, and the baby's positioning suggested possible complications during delivery. "You need proper nutrition, Mrs. Boone," he'd said gently, settling his wire-rimmed spectacles more firmly on his nose. "Fresh meat, vegetables, milk daily. The baby is taking what it needs from your body, but there isn't enough to sustain you both." Clara had nodded, knowing full well that proper nutrition was a luxury she couldn't afford. The wages from Henderson's general store barely covered rent and basic necessities. Fresh meat was a rare treat, vegetables were limited to what she could grow in her tiny garden plot, and milk was expensive enough to be saved for special occasions. "I'll do my best, Doctor," she'd replied, the same words she'd given him during his previous visit. Dr. Morrison had studied her for a long moment, his weathered face reflecting the concern of a man who delivered hundreds of babies and recognized dangerous situations when he saw them. "Mrs. Boone, I hope you'll reconsider Mr. McGraw's offer of assistance. Your pride is admirable, but it's not worth your life or your child's." The mention of Silas McGraw brought a familiar flutter of confusion to Clara's chest. Since her collapse, the mysterious rancher had appeared in her life with increasing frequency. He'd paid her medical bills without being asked, arranged for Dr. Morrison's follow-up visits, and somehow managed to have fresh bread and milk delivered to her cabin twice a week, gifts that came without notes or explanations, but that everyone in town knew originated from the McGraw ranch. Clara's attempts to repay these kindnesses had been firmly but politely deflected. When she'd tried to return the money for her medical bills, Silas had simply smiled and suggested she could settle accounts later when she was feeling stronger. When she'd cornered Mrs. Henderson about who was paying for the groceries, the store owner had grown mysteriously vague, claiming only that arrangements had been made and she shouldn't worry herself about the details. The whole situation made Clara deeply uncomfortable. She'd built her identity around self-reliance, particularly since Thomas's death had left her alone in the world. Accepting help, especially from a man she barely knew, felt like a betrayal of the independence she'd fought so hard to maintain. Yet she couldn't deny that Silas's interventions had probably saved her life, and quite possibly her baby's as well. What troubled her most was the intensity she sometimes caught in his eyes when he looked at her. It wasn't the casual concern of a good Samaritan or even the distant charity of a wealthy man helping the less fortunate. There was something deeper there, something that suggested a personal investment in her welfare that made no sense given their brief acquaintance. A soft knock at her door interrupted these troubling thoughts. Clara rose carefully from her chair, one hand pressed to her lower back where a persistent ache had been growing stronger each day. Through the window, she could see Silas McGraw standing on her small porch, hat in hand, and an expression of careful determination on his weathered face. "Mr. McGraw," she said, opening the door but remaining in the doorway. "This is unexpected." "Mrs. Boone," he nodded politely. "I wondered if I might speak with you for a few minutes. There are some matters we should discuss." Clara hesitated. Having him in her small cabin felt too intimate, too much like accepting a level of familiarity she wasn't ready for. But the alternative, conducting serious conversation on her front porch, where half the town could observe and speculate, seemed equally unpalatable. "Please, come in," she said finally, stepping aside to allow him entry. Silas entered respectfully, removing his boots at the threshold without being asked, and hanging his hat on the peg by the door. The small gesture of consideration surprised Clara. Most men of his social standing expected others to clean up after them, but Silas moved through her space with the careful awareness of someone who understood what it meant to keep house on limited resources. His presence immediately made the cabin feel smaller. At well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that spoke of years of physical labor, he seemed to fill the tiny room completely. Clara gestured toward the single chair beside her kitchen table, while she remained standing, with one hand resting on the table's edge for support. "How are you feeling?" Silas asked, his eyes taking in the persistent pallor of her complexion and the way she favored her left side when she moved. "Better, thank you. Dr. Morrison says the baby is developing normally." "And what does he say about you?" The directness of the question caught Clara off guard. Most people asked about her health in the vague, socially acceptable way that expected reassuring answers regardless of the truth. Silas's question demanded honesty, and something in his tone suggested he would recognize evasion if she attempted it. "He's concerned," she admitted. "But I'm managing." Silas studied her for a moment, then glanced around the cabin with the appraising eye of someone who understood exactly what managing meant in this context. His gaze lingered on the recipe book, still open on the table, and Clara saw something shift in his expression. "That belonged to your mother?" he asked gently. "Yes." Clara's hand moved protectively to the book's worn cover. "She recorded all our family recipes. I was hoping to—" She stopped herself, unwilling to share the private dream of cooking these meals for her own children someday. "To pass them on to your child," Silas finished softly. The understanding in his voice made Clara's throat tighten unexpectedly. "Yes," she whispered. Silas leaned forward slightly, his expression growing more serious. "Mrs. Boone, Clara, there are things you don't know about your situation, about why I've been helping you. I owe you an explanation." Clara felt her pulse quicken. The intensity in his voice confirmed what she'd suspected. There was more to his assistance than simple charity. What kind of explanation? Before Silas could answer, another knock sounded at the door. Clara frowned. She rarely received visitors, and 2 in one afternoon was unprecedented. She opened the door to find a well-dressed stranger holding an expensive leather satchel, his clothes marking him as someone from outside Dustwater's usual population. "Mrs. Clara Boone?" the man inquired politely. "Yes? My name is Dr. James Whitfield. I'm a specialist in maternal medicine from Kansas City. Mr. McGraw has asked me to examine you and provide recommendations for your care." Clara's blood ran cold. She turned slowly to face Silas, who was rising from his chair with an expression that was both apologetic and determined. "You arranged this without telling me?" she asked, her voice barely controlled. "Clara, please understand." "No." The word came out sharper than she'd intended. "I understand perfectly. You think because you have money, you can make decisions about my life without consulting me. You think because I'm poor and pregnant and alone, I don't have the right to choose my own medical care." Dr. Whitfield looked between them uncertainly, clearly sensing he'd walked into a domestic dispute rather than a simple medical consultation. "I'll thank you both to leave," Clara said, her voice trembling with anger and hurt. "I may be poor, Mr. McGraw, but I'm not your property to manage as you see fit." The look that crossed Silas's face was one of such pain that Clara felt her anger waver for a moment. But she held firm, standing straighter despite the ache in her back and the exhaustion that made every confrontation feel like climbing a mountain. "Clara," Silas said quietly, "if you'll just let me explain why." "The time for explanations was before you took over my life without permission," Clara interrupted. "I asked you to leave." Silas stood silently for a long moment, then nodded once. He collected his hat and moved toward the door, Dr. Whitfield following uncertainly behind him. At the threshold, Silas paused. "The offer stands," he said without turning around. "When you're ready to hear the truth, I'll be here." Clara closed the door behind them and leaned against it, her hands shaking as the confrontation's aftermath washed over her. The recipe book still lay open on her table, her mother's careful handwriting, promising meals that required ingredients she couldn't afford for a family she was raising alone. Outside, she could hear the murmur of voices as Silas spoke with the specialist he'd brought from Kansas City. The knowledge that he was wealthy enough to summon doctors from hundreds of miles away only deepened her sense of being overwhelmed by forces beyond her control. She'd fought so hard to maintain her independence after Thomas's death, and now it seemed that independence was the very thing that might cost her everything she had left to lose. The wooden box sat on Clara's kitchen table like a sacred relic, its worn corners and brass hinges speaking of careful preservation over many years. Silas had brought it 3 days after their confrontation, leaving it on her doorstep with a simple note: "Thomas's belongings from the drive. Thought you should have them." Clara had found it that morning when she stepped out to collect water from her well. For hours, she'd circled the box like a wary animal, afraid of what memories might spill out when she lifted the lid. Thomas had been gone for 9 months, and she'd begun the difficult process of learning to live with his absence. Opening this container felt like inviting his ghost back into her carefully ordered grief. But curiosity and love proved stronger than fear. As evening shadows lengthened across her small cabin, Clara finally worked up the courage to open the clasp and peer inside. The contents were heartbreakingly modest, the few personal items Thomas had carried during his final cattle drive, his spare shirt, still faintly scented with the sage and leather smells of the trail, a small leather pouch containing $17.32, his wages for the drive that had cost his life, his bone-handled pocket knife, worn smooth from years of use, a handful of smooth stones he'd collected along the trail, each one chosen for some quality that had caught his fancy. But it was the letter that stopped Clara's breath completely. The envelope was addressed in Thomas's careful handwriting, "For my beloved Clara." Inside, 3 pages covered with the words he'd written during quiet moments around the campfire, when thoughts of home had overwhelmed him with love and longing. "My dearest wife," the letter began, "I write this by firelight on our last night before the river crossing. Tomorrow we'll be in Kansas City, and then I'll start the long journey home to you. I can barely contain my excitement at the thought of seeing your beautiful face again and holding you in my arms." Clara's hands trembled as she read, Thomas's voice so clear in the words that she could almost hear him speaking them aloud. He wrote of his plans for their future, the land he hoped to buy, the house he wanted to build, where they could raise their children in comfort and security. "I've been talking to Mr. McGraw about our plans," Thomas continued. "He's a good man, Clara, fair in his dealings and generous with his knowledge. He treats his hands with respect, pays honest wages, and expects nothing but good work in return. When we get back, I plan to ask him for a loan to help us get started on our own place. I believe he'll say yes. We've talked often during this drive, and I think he sees something in me worth investing in." The words painted a picture of the future Thomas had envisioned, a future that had died with him in the mud of the Cimarron River. But they also revealed something Clara hadn't known. Thomas had respected Silas McGraw, had seen him as a mentor and potential benefactor. The disconnect between Thomas's assessment and her own suspicious reaction to the man's help created an uncomfortable tension in her chest. "I know you worry about me on these drives," Thomas wrote, "but please know that Mr. McGraw runs a careful operation. He doesn't take unnecessary risks with his men or his cattle. If anything happens, and I don't believe it will, you can trust him to do right by you. He's the kind of man who keeps his word, no matter the cost." Clara felt tears gathering as she read these words. Thomas's faith in Silas McGraw shone through every sentence, and she began to understand why the rancher had been so determined to help her. This wasn't charity offered to a stranger. This was a debt of honor to a man who had trusted him with his life and the welfare of his family. The letter's final section was the most personal, filled with Thomas's excitement about becoming a father and his dreams for their unborn child. "I can hardly believe we're going to have a baby," he wrote. "I lie awake at night sometimes, imagining what our child will look like, whether it will have your beautiful eyes or your sweet disposition. I promise you, Clara, our child will never want for anything love, security, or opportunity. I'll work every day of my life to give our family the life you both deserve." Those dreams had died with Thomas, but as Clara finished reading his letter, she began to see Silas's actions in a different light. He wasn't trying to control her life or reduce her to charity case status. He was trying to honor the promise Thomas had written about ensuring their child would never want for anything. A gentle knock at her door interrupted these thoughts. Clara quickly wiped her tears and composed herself before opening it to find Silas standing on her porch, hat in hand, and expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Boone," he said formally, "I came to see if you'd had a chance to go through Thomas's belongings." Clara nodded, stepping aside to let him enter. The wooden box still sat open on her table, its contents spread around the letter she'd been reading. Silas's eyes found the letter immediately, and something in his expression softened. "He wrote about you," Clara said quietly. "About the loan he planned to ask for." "He was a good man," Silas replied. "Honest, hard-working, devoted to his family. I would have been proud to help him get started." Clara moved to the table and picked up the letter, holding it like the precious thing it was. "He trusted you," she said. "Completely." "Yes, and you've been trying to honor that trust by helping me." Silas met her eyes directly. "I've been trying to honor more than trust, Clara. I've been trying to honor a debt that can never be fully repaid." Something in his tone made Clara's pulse quicken. What kind of debt? Silas was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands turning his hat brim in a nervous gesture she'd never seen from him before. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of months of suppressed guilt. "Thomas died saving my life," he said simply. "He pulled me from under my horse when I was trapped in the river. The cattle that killed him were running because I'd made the decision to cross in bad weather. His death is on my conscience, and his final words were a plea for me to find you and make sure you were cared for." Clara felt the world shift around her, as if the ground beneath her feet had suddenly become uncertain. "You were there," she whispered, "when Thomas died." "I was there," Silas confirmed. "I was the man whose life he saved." The implications crashed over Clara like a physical wave. Every kindness Silas had shown her, every medical bill he'd paid, every groceries delivery, all of it came from guilt and obligation, not genuine concern for her welfare. She was a duty to be discharged, a promise to be kept to a dead friend. "So this is all about guilt," she said, her voice barely audible. "No," Silas said firmly. "It started with guilt and obligation, but it's become something more than that. Clara, these past weeks, getting to know you, seeing your strength and dignity—" "Don't," Clara interrupted, holding up her hand. "Please don't make this about something it isn't. You have a debt to pay to Thomas's memory, and I'm the means of paying it. I understand that now. That's not true." "It explains everything," Clara continued, her voice growing stronger as understanding crystallized. "Why you were so determined to help despite my protests. Why you brought specialists from Kansas City without consulting me. You're not helping me, you're helping Thomas. I'm just the vessel for your guilt." Silas stepped toward her, his expression anguished. "Clara, please listen. I think you should go," she said quietly. "I need time to think about all of this." Silas stood silently for a moment, then nodded. "The offer of help still stands," he said. "Whatever my motivation started as, what matters now is that you and your child are safe." After he left, Clara sank into her chair and reread Thomas's letter, seeing it now through the lens of what she'd learned. Thomas had trusted Silas McGraw completely, had seen him as a good man worthy of respect and partnership. But Thomas had never imagined that his trust would become a burden of guilt that would bind his widow to the man whose life he'd saved. The recipe book lay beside the letter, its pages still promising family meals and traditions to pass on to future generations. Clara touched both items gently, these tangible connections to the love she'd lost and the future she was fighting to build. Thomas had believed in Silas McGraw's character. The question now was whether Clara could separate the man from the guilt that drove him, and whether accepting his help meant betraying her own independence or honoring her husband's final trust. The manila envelope arrived with the morning mail. Delivered by young Jimmy Patterson, who worked part-time for the Territorial Postal Service, Clara almost didn't open it. Official correspondence rarely brought good news to widows living on store clerks' wages. But her name was written clearly across the front in legal script, and curiosity eventually overcame caution. Inside, she found documents that made no immediate sense. Legal papers covered in dense type, bearing official seals and signatures from the Dustwater land office. At first glance, they appeared to concern a property transaction for land she'd never heard of. But as Clara read more carefully, her heart began to race. The land deed was made out in Thomas Michael Boone's name, dated 3 weeks before his death. 160 acres of prime grazing land along Willow Creek, purchased for the sum of $800 with a down payment of $200 recorded. The remaining $600 had been due within 60 days of the contract, signing a deadline that had passed while Thomas lay buried in Dustwater's cemetery. Clara read the deed 3 times before the full implications sank in. Thomas had secretly bought land. Not just any land, but valuable creekside acreage that any rancher would covet. And according to the accompanying documents, the deed transferred to his widow upon his death, making Clara the legal owner of property she'd never known existed. Her hands shook as she studied a hand-drawn map showing the land's boundaries. The property ran along Willow Creek for nearly 2 miles, providing year-round water access that made it ideal for cattle ranching. The deed described improvements already in place: a small cabin, a barn, and several miles of good fencing. This wasn't raw homestead land. This was a working ranch in miniature, exactly the kind of spread Thomas had dreamed of owning. A second envelope contained correspondence from the Dustwater Bank, explaining the situation in more accessible terms. Thomas had made the down payment and signed the deed, but his death had complicated the final transaction. The bank had held the property in trust, attempting to locate his next of kin to complete or cancel the sale. Now that Clara had been found, she could either pay the remaining balance and take full ownership, or forfeit the property and lose the down payment Thomas had already made. Clara sank into her kitchen chair, overwhelmed by this revelation. Thomas had been planning their future in secret, saving money she'd never known about to buy the land that would make his dreams reality. He died believing he would return home to surprise her with news of their new beginning, never knowing that his careful plans would become another source of struggle for the widow he left behind. The financial implications were staggering. Clara had perhaps $30 to her name, nowhere near the $600 needed to complete the purchase. But losing the land meant losing Thomas's down payment and the dreams he'd invested in it. Worse, it meant letting his sacrifice become meaningless, allowing his careful plans to turn to dust because she couldn't find a way to honor them. A sharp knock at her door interrupted these overwhelmed thoughts. Clara opened it to find Rex Dalton standing on her porch, his expensive clothes and calculating smile marking him immediately as trouble. She'd seen him around town, occasionally a successful cattle rancher whose holdings rivaled even Silas McGraw's operation, though his methods were rumored to be less scrupulous. "Mrs. Boone," Dalton said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I've come about a business matter that might interest you." Clara stepped onto her porch rather than inviting him inside, instinctively wary of his too smooth manner. "What kind of business?" "I understand you've recently come into ownership of some land along Willow Creek," Dalton continued, his eyes never quite meeting hers directly. "Fine grazing country, from what I hear. I'd like to make you an offer." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "How do you know about the land?" Dalton's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Word travels fast in a small town, Mrs. Boone, especially when it concerns property transactions. The thing is, that land's been causing some confusion at the land office. Questions about whether the original purchase was properly completed, whether the deed is really valid." "The deed is perfectly valid," Clara said, though uncertainty crept into her voice. "My husband completed the purchase before his death." "Well now, that's where things get complicated," Dalton replied, his tone taking on a patronizing quality that made Clara's spine stiffen. "Your husband made a down payment, true enough, but he never completed the transaction. According to territorial law, incomplete land purchases revert to public sale after 90 days. That deadline passed 2 months ago." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "That can't be right." "I'm afraid it is," Dalton said with false sympathy. "The bank should have explained the situation more clearly. But don't you worry, I'm prepared to make you a generous offer for whatever claim you might have. Say, $50 for your trouble, and we'll call the matter settled." The offer was so insultingly low that Clara almost laughed. Even if the deed was questionable, Thomas's $200 down payment alone was worth far more than $50. This wasn't a legitimate business proposition. This was an attempt to steal her inheritance through legal intimidation and her own ignorance. "I'll need to consult with a lawyer," Clara said carefully. Dalton's expression hardened slightly. "That would be expensive, Mrs. Boone. Lawyers charge more than you could afford, especially for cases that might not turn out in your favor. My offer is generous, considering the circumstances. I'd hate to see you spend money you don't have on legal fees, only to end up with nothing." The threat was clear despite its polite wrapping. Dalton was counting on her poverty and isolation to force acceptance of his terms. He probably assumed that a pregnant widow would be too desperate and frightened to fight for what was rightfully hers. "I said I need time to consider," Clara repeated firmly. "Of course," Dalton agreed, though his smile had turned cold. "But don't take too long. I might not feel so generous if this drags out, and Mrs. Boone, you might want to be careful who you discuss this matter with. Some folks might try to take advantage of your situation." After he left, Clara returned to her cabin and spread the land documents across her table beside Thomas's letter. Reading his words again with this new knowledge, she began to understand the full scope of what he'd been planning. The loan he'd intended to ask Silas for that would have been to complete this land purchase. Thomas had already taken the first step toward their dream, investing every dollar he could save in the down payment for their future ranch. But now that future was under attack by a man who saw opportunity in her husband's death and her own vulnerability. Dalton was clearly trying to steal the land through legal manipulation, counting on her ignorance and lack of resources to succeed. The question was whether she could find a way to fight back. Clara thought about Silas's repeated offers of help, which she'd rebuffed out of pride, and more recently, anger over learning about his guilt-driven motivations. But Thomas's letter made it clear that her husband had trusted Silas completely, had seen him as an ally rather than a threat. Perhaps it was time to set aside her pride and accept that she couldn't fight this battle alone. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd been so determined to remain independent, to avoid becoming anyone's charity case, that she'd nearly missed the chance to claim the independence Thomas had died trying to secure for her. The land represented everything he'd worked for: financial security, a future for their child, and the kind of life they'd dreamed of building together. If Dalton succeeded in stealing this inheritance, it would be the final victory of Thomas's death over his dreams. But if Clara could find a way to complete the purchase and claim what was rightfully hers, she could honor her husband's memory while securing her child's future. The decision crystallized with sudden clarity. She would swallow her pride, accept Silas's help, and fight for the legacy Thomas had died trying to give her. Whatever debt existed between them, whatever guilt drove his actions, didn't matter as much as protecting what Thomas had sacrificed to obtain. Clara carefully folded the deed and tucked it inside Thomas's letter, then reached for her shawl. It was time to pay Silas McGraw a visit and discover whether his offers of assistance extended to fighting off land thieves who preyed on widows. Thomas had trusted the man with his life. Now Clara would have to trust him with their future. Silas McGraw pulled his Winchester rifle from the gun cabinet in his study, the familiar weight of the weapon bringing a grim comfort as he checked the action and loaded fresh cartridges. The rifle had served him faithfully for 15 years, through cattle rustlers, predator control, and the occasional boundary dispute that required more than words to settle. Tonight, he suspected he would need every advantage the well-maintained firearm could provide. Clara's visit that afternoon had changed everything. When she'd arrived at his ranch house, carrying Thomas's land deed and Rex Dalton's threats, the pieces of a larger puzzle had finally fallen into place. Silas had suspected for months that someone was systematically acquiring small ranches and homesteads around Dustwater, but he'd assumed it was legitimate business expansion. Now he understood he was dealing with something far more sinister. The confrontation had been building for years, though Silas hadn't recognized it until today. Rex Dalton's operation had been growing steadily, absorbing smaller properties through methods that always seemed to skirt the edge of legality without quite crossing into outright criminality. Foreclosures on struggling homesteaders, technical violations of grazing permits, boundary disputes that somehow always resolved in Dalton's favor. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. But Thomas Boone's land represented something different. The Willow Creek property was prime grazing territory that Dalton needed to complete a corridor between his northern and southern holdings. Without it, his cattle would have to be driven 20 miles around to reach seasonal pastures, a costly inefficiency that would cut deeply into his profits. Thomas's death had given Dalton the opening he needed to claim the land through legal manipulation, but Clara's discovery of the deed had thrown his plans into chaos. Silas understood now why Dalton had been so eager to complete the Cimarron River crossing despite the dangerous weather conditions. The cattle drive Silas had been hired to lead included steers from several smaller ranches, men who were struggling financially and couldn't afford to lose their investment in a delayed or failed drive. If the crossing had gone badly, if cattle had been lost or men injured, those ranchers would have faced financial ruin, forcing them to sell their land to pay debts. Thomas Boone's death hadn't been an accident. It had been the tragic consequence of Dalton's greed and willingness to risk other men's lives for his own profit. The knowledge sat in Silas's chest like a physical weight, adding another layer of guilt to the burden he already carried. If he'd been more suspicious of Dalton's insistence on the dangerous crossing, if he'd trusted his own instincts about the weather, Thomas might still be alive. Clara had listened to his explanation with the stoic composure that had become her trademark, but Silas could see the fear in her eyes despite her brave front. She was 7 months pregnant now, visibly struggling with the physical demands of her condition, and the stress of Dalton's threats was taking a toll on her already fragile health. Dr. Morrison had been blunt in his assessment. Clara needed rest, proper nutrition, and freedom from anxiety if she was going to carry the baby to term safely. "What can we do?" she'd asked, when Silas finished explaining the scope of Dalton's operation. "He has lawyers, money, influence. I have a deed that might not even be valid, and $30 to my name." Silas had studied the land documents carefully, his years of business experience helping him parse the legal language that had confused Clara. The deed was valid, but Dalton's claim about the 90-day deadline wasn't entirely wrong. Thomas's death had created a legal grey area that could be exploited by someone with enough money to hire the right lawyers and influence the right officials. "The deed is solid," he'd assured Clara. "Thomas completed all the necessary paperwork before his death. The bank was holding the property in trust while they located you, which is perfectly legal. But Dalton can tie this up in court for months, maybe years. He's counting on you not having the resources to fight a prolonged legal battle." "So he wins by default," Clara had said bitterly. "Not necessarily," Silas had replied, a plan beginning to form in his mind. "Dalton's operation depends on people being too intimidated or too poor to fight back. But what if he was fighting someone with the resources to match his own? What if you weren't alone in this?" The conversation that followed had been difficult for both of them. Clara's pride still rebelled against accepting help, especially from a man whose assistance was motivated by guilt over her husband's death. But the stakes were too high for pride to matter. If Dalton succeeded in stealing Thomas's land, he would have won a complete victory over the dreams that had died with him on the Cimarron River. Silas had proposed a partnership. He would provide the money to complete the land purchase and the legal support to fight Dalton's challenge, in exchange for grazing rights on the property and a share of any profits from its eventual development. It was a fair business arrangement that preserved Clara's ownership while giving her the backing she needed to defend her inheritance. Clara had agreed, though Silas could see the decision cost her dearly. Accepting his help meant acknowledging her vulnerability and dependence on others, exactly the kind of admission she'd been fighting against since Thomas's death. But she'd made the choice with her unborn child's future in mind, setting aside her own pride for the sake of the legacy Thomas had died trying to secure. Now, as Silas prepared his rifle and checked his ammunition, he faced the reality of what their partnership would require. Dalton wasn't the type of man to accept defeat gracefully, especially when it involved losing something he'd been planning to acquire for years. The veiled threats he'd made to Clara were just the beginning. Silas expected the situation to escalate quickly once Dalton learned he was no longer dealing with an isolated widow, but with someone who could fight back on equal terms. A soft knock at his study door interrupted these grim preparations. Silas opened it to find Miguel Santos, his foreman, standing in the hallway with an expression of urgent concern. "Senor McGraw," Miguel said in his accented English, "there are riders approaching the house. 5 men, heavily armed, they're flying Dalton's brand." Silas felt his pulse quicken. He'd expected retaliation, but not this quickly. "How far out?" "Perhaps 10 minutes at their current pace," Miguel replied. "They're not trying to hide their approach." That was significant. If Dalton's men were riding openly to the ranch house, they weren't planning a surprise attack. This was meant to be a demonstration of force, a show of strength designed to intimidate rather than destroy. But armed demonstrations had a way of turning violent when pride and money were at stake. "Gather the men," Silas ordered. "Full weapons, but keep them out of sight unless shooting starts. I want to talk to these riders, but I want backup ready if words aren't enough." Miguel nodded and disappeared into the night to organize the ranch hands. Silas finished loading his rifle and checked his sidearm, a Colt revolver that had never failed him in 20 years of frontier life. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he'd learned long ago that appearing weak invited the very violence you hope to avoid. As he prepared to face whatever Dalton's men had brought to his door, Silas thought about Clara alone in her cabin, probably lying awake with worry and fear. She was carrying Thomas's child and facing threats that no woman should have to endure alone. But she wasn't alone anymore. Silas had given his word to protect her and her inheritance, and he intended to keep that promise regardless of what it cost him. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder in the night air. Through his study window, Silas could see lantern light flickering as his ranch hands took positions around the house and outbuildings. Miguel had trained them well. They would be ready for whatever came next. Silas took a deep breath and walked to his front door. The Winchester held ready, but not raised in obvious threat. The conversation about to take place would determine whether this conflict could be resolved with words or would require the kind of frontier justice that settled disputes with gunpowder and lead. Behind him, the grandfather clock in his study chimed 11 times, marking another hour's passage in what was likely to be the longest night of his life. By dawn, he would either have established a peaceful resolution to Dalton's threats, or he would be preparing for the kind of range war that could destroy everything he'd spent a lifetime building. Thomas Boone had died saving his life on the Cimarron River. Tonight, Silas would discover whether he possessed the courage to risk that life defending Thomas's widow and the dreams Thomas had died trying to achieve. The debt between them demanded nothing less than everything Silas had to give. The 5 riders approached Silas's ranch house with the deliberate arrogance of men accustomed to intimidating their way through problems. Rex Dalton rode in the center, his expensive clothes and silver-trimmed saddle marking him as clearly as a banner. The men flanking him were hired guns, hard-faced professionals whose hands rested casually near their weapons as they surveyed the ranch buildings for signs of resistance. Silas stepped onto his front porch, the Winchester held low but ready, his presence commanding despite being outnumbered. The years of managing a large ranch operation had taught him the value of projecting calm authority even when facing superior force. Behind him, he could sense, rather than see, his ranch hands taking positions in the shadows, their own weapons trained on the approaching riders. "Dalton," Silas acknowledged, as the group reined in 20 feet from the porch. "This is private property. State your business or move along." Rex Dalton's smile was cold as winter wind. My business is with you, McGraw. Seems you've been interfering in matters that don't concern you. That widow's land problem that's between her and me. Your involvement complicates things unnecessarily. Mrs. Boone asked for my assistance as a business partner, Silas replied evenly. Her husband's property is legally hers, and she has every right to seek help defending it. Her husband's property? Dalton laughed harshly. Thomas Boone never completed that land purchase. The deed's worthless paper, and you know it. I'm offering the woman a fair price for a questionable claim. More than generous, considering her circumstances. Silas felt his anger rising but kept his voice level. $50 for land worth 20 times. That amount isn't generosity, it's theft. Strong words from a man who's got himself into something he doesn't understand, Dalton said, his tone hardening. You think your money and your reputation protect you from the consequences of poor decisions. The threat was clear, despite its diplomatic wrapping. Silas had expected this. Dalton's operation depended on fear and intimidation, and Clara's resistance, backed by Silas's resources, threatened the entire system. If word spread that Dalton could be successfully challenged, other victims might find the courage to fight back. I understand perfectly, Silas said. You've been stealing land from struggling families for years, using legal technicalities and intimidation to build your empire. Thomas Boone's death gave you another opportunity, but this time you picked the wrong victim. Dalton's expression darkened. Careful, McGraw. You're making accusations you can't prove. Can't I? Silas reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded document, the brand registration papers he'd retrieved from the territorial office that afternoon. Interesting thing about cattle brands, Dalton. They tell stories when you know how to read them. He unfolded the paper slowly, letting the tension build. This is a list of brand registrations filed in your name over the past 3 years. Funny how many of them match brands that belong to ranchers who lost their land to foreclosure or legal disputes. According to territorial law, using another man's brand is cattle rustling, a hanging offense. The silence stretched taut as Dalton processed the implications. His hired guns shifted nervously in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons. The brand registration document represented evidence that could destroy Dalton's entire operation and send him to the gallows. You're playing a dangerous game, Dalton said finally, his voice tight with controlled fury. No, Silas corrected. I'm ending one. Your operation stops here tonight. You'll withdraw your claim on Mrs. Boone's land, and you'll cease harassing struggling ranchers throughout this territory. In exchange, these brand registration papers disappear and no questions are asked about your past activities. Dalton's laugh held no humor. And if I refuse? Then, tomorrow morning, these papers go to the territorial marshal, along with sworn statements from every rancher you've cheated and a full accounting of your activities. Your choice: ride away tonight and start over somewhere else, or face a judge and jury who don't look kindly on cattle thieves. The standoff stretched for long seconds, the only sounds the creak of leather and the snorting of horses. Dalton's men were professionals, but they were hired guns, not zealots. If shooting started, some of them would die, and dead men couldn't spend their wages. The brand papers in Silas's hand represented proof that could hang their employer, making loyalty a questionable investment. Dalton's hand dropped toward his gun with sudden violence. You sanctimonious son of... The Winchester in Silas's hands roared, the bullet taking Dalton's hat clean off his head and burying itself in the cottonwood tree behind him. The other riders' horses shied at the sudden noise, but none of them drew their weapons. The muzzle flashes from the ranch buildings around them made it clear they were surrounded by men with clear shots. Next one goes through your heart, Silas said calmly, already working the rifle's action to chamber another round. Your choice, Dalton. Rex Dalton sat his horse with forced stillness, his face white with rage and fear. Around him, His hired guns waited for orders that could mean death for all of them. The brand registration papers fluttered slightly in the night breeze, evidence that could destroy everything Dalton had built through years of careful criminality. "This isn't over," Dalton snarled. "Yes," Silas said quietly, "it is." Silas's horse thundered through the night toward Dustwater, his heart pounding with urgency that had nothing to do with the hard ride. After Dalton and his men had retreated from the ranch, Miguel had brought word that changed everything. Clara had gone into labor 2 weeks early, and Dr. Morrison was struggling with serious complications. The blue wool blanket lay folded in Silas's saddlebag, purchased that afternoon from Henderson's general store in preparation for the baby's arrival. He'd chosen it carefully, imagining how it would look wrapped around Thomas's child, and had asked Mrs. Henderson to embroider the initials T.B. in delicate white thread. The blanket represented his commitment to the family he'd promised to protect, a promise that seemed increasingly fragile as his horse's hooves ate up the miles between him and Clara's bedside. Dr. Morrison met him at Clara's cabin door, his weathered face grim with exhaustion and concern. The physician had been working for hours, fighting to save both mother and child against complications that threatened to claim them both. "How is she?" Silas asked without preamble, tying his horse to the porch rail and pulling the blue blanket from his saddlebag. "Alive," the doctor replied tersely. "Barely. The baby's positioning is wrong, and she's lost considerable blood. I've done what I can." But he shrugged helplessly, the gesture of a man who'd reached the limits of frontier medical knowledge. Silas entered the small cabin to find Clara propped up in her narrow bed, her face pale as candle wax and her breathing shallow. Mrs. Patterson, the town midwife, sat beside her holding a tiny bundle that stirred with the weak movements of new life. The baby had been born, but both mother and child remained in serious danger. "Mr. McGraw," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "You came." "Of course I came," Silas replied, kneeling beside the bed and taking her cold hand in his. "How are you feeling?" Clara's smile was weak but genuine. "Like I've been trampled by cattle," she said, then winced as the effort of speaking caused obvious pain. "But he's beautiful, isn't he?" Mrs. Patterson carefully transferred the baby to Silas's arms, the infant so small and fragile that he seemed almost weightless. The child's eyes were closed, his breathing rapid but steady, his tiny fists clenched with the determination of someone fighting to stay in a world that had nearly rejected him. "He looks like Thomas," Clara murmured, tears gathering in her eyes. "Same stubborn chin, same way of holding his hands when he's determined about something." Silas felt his throat tighten as he studied the baby's face. Thomas's son, the child who would carry forward the dreams that had died on the Cimarron River. This tiny, vulnerable being represented everything Thomas had worked and died for, and everything Clara had fought to protect during the long months of her pregnancy. "What will you name him?" Silas asked softly. Clara was quiet for a moment, her eyes fixed on her son's sleeping face. "Thomas Samuel," she said finally. "Thomas for his father, and Samuel." She paused, meeting Silas's eyes directly. "Samuel for the man who kept his promise to Thomas. For you." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. "Clara, I don't deserve—" "Yes, you do," she interrupted, her voice gaining strength despite her exhaustion. "I know why you helped me. I know about the guilt you carry. But what you've done standing up to Dalton, protecting the land Thomas bought, being here when his son was born, that goes beyond obligation. That's love." Silas carefully unwrapped the blue blanket and tucked it around the baby, the soft wool engulfing the tiny form like a protective cocoon. The initials T.B. were perfectly embroidered in one corner, but now they would stand for a new Thomas Boone, a child who would grow up knowing he was wanted and protected by people who had loved his father. "I've been thinking," Clara continued, her hand reaching out to touch the blanket's edge, "about what Thomas wrote in his letter. about trusting you. And this baby, our baby, he's going to need a father figure in his life. Dr. Morrison cleared his throat from the corner where he'd been quietly monitoring Clara's condition. Mrs. Boone, you need rest. The delivery was difficult, and you're still at risk for complications. No more talking tonight. Clara nodded obediently, but her eyes remained fixed on Silas as he held her son. Will you stay, she asked, until we're both stronger? I don't want to face this alone anymore. I'm not going anywhere, Silas promised, settling into the chair beside her bed with Thomas Samuel still cradled in his arms. Thomas trusted me to take care of his family. That's exactly what I intend to do. As Clara's breathing deepened into the sleep her exhausted body demanded, Silas sat in the lamplit cabin, holding the baby who represented both an ending and a beginning. Thomas Boone's death had brought them together, but his son's birth was creating something new. A family forged not from blood alone, but from love, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds of shared purpose. The blue blanket rose and fell gently with the baby's breathing, a tangible reminder of the promise Silas had made and the future they were building together from the ashes of tragedy. The family photograph sat prominently on the mantel of Silas McGraw's ranch house, its silver frame catching the warm light of the autumn afternoon. In it, Clara held 6-month-old Thomas Samuel, while Silas stood beside them, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. The photographer had captured something precious in that moment, the quiet contentment of people who had found their way home to each other through loss and healing. Clara studied the image as she prepared tea for their weekly ritual, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The woman in the photograph looked nothing like the desperate widow who had collapsed on Dustwater's main street nearly a year ago. This Clara had color in her cheeks, laughter in her eyes, and the peaceful bearing of someone who had found her place in the world. Thomas Samuel gurgled happily from his cradle near the fireplace, his bright eyes following the dancing flames with the fascination of a child discovering wonder in ordinary things. At 6 months, he was healthy and strong, with his father's determined chin and his mother's gentle nature. The blue blanket that had welcomed him into the world now served as his favorite comfort, worn soft from countless washings and adventures. He's getting so big, Silas observed, entering the parlor with fresh wood for the fire. His own transformation over the past months was equally remarkable. The lines of grief and guilt that had marked his features had softened into something approaching peace. Won't be long before he's walking and getting into everything. Clara laughed as she poured tea into their best china cups, another change that marked how their circumstances had evolved. Mrs. Patterson says he'll be crawling within the month. We'd better start baby-proofing the house. The house. Clara still marveled at how naturally she'd begun thinking of Silas's ranch as home. The transition hadn't happened overnight. After Thomas Samuel's birth, she'd spent 3 weeks recuperating in her cabin while Silas visited daily, helping with the baby and ensuring she received proper care. But as her strength returned and their bond deepened, the arrangement had evolved naturally into something more permanent. They weren't married yet, though the subject had been discussed with the comfortable honesty that had grown between them. Clara needed time to fully heal from Thomas's death and the trauma of nearly losing both her life and her child. Silas understood and respected that need, content to let their relationship develop at its own pace without pressure or expectations. I rode out to the Willow Creek property yesterday, Silas mentioned, settling into his favorite chair with his tea. The cabin's nearly ready for the new tenants, young couple from Nebraska, looking to start their own cattle operation. They remind me a lot of Thomas, hardworking, honest, full of dreams about their future. Clara nodded approvingly. They'd decided to develop Thomas's land as rental property for struggling young ranchers, providing affordable housing and grazing rights in exchange for help managing the expanded operation. It seemed like the kind of legacy Thomas would have wanted, his sacrifice helping other families achieve the dreams he'd never lived to see fulfilled. Rex Dalton had disappeared shortly after the confrontation at Silas's ranch, taking his hired guns and heading west toward California. Word had filtered back through various channels that he'd sold his remaining legitimate holdings and vanished completely, apparently deciding that starting over elsewhere was preferable to facing territorial justice. The brand registration papers that had ended his local reign of terror remained locked in Silas's safe insurance against the unlikely possibility of his return. "Speaking of Thomas," Clara said softly, "I thought we might visit the cemetery this afternoon. It's been 2 weeks since our last trip, and I want to tell him about the baby's new tooth." These visits had become a cornerstone of their healing process. Initially, Clara had gone alone, but gradually Silas had begun accompanying her, standing respectfully silent while she shared news and memories with her late husband's grave. Over time, his own words had joined hers expressions of gratitude, reports on the ranch's progress, and promises to honor Thomas's memory through the care of his family. The conversations were never morbid or dwelling on loss. Instead, they had evolved into celebrations of Thomas's continuing influence on their lives, the values he'd embodied, the dreams he'd pursued, and the love he'd left behind that continued to shape their decisions and priorities. "He'd be so proud," Silas said, watching Thomas Samuel wave his tiny fists at invisible targets. "His son is growing up strong and loved, his wife is thriving, and his land is helping other families build their futures. Everything he worked for is bearing fruit." Clara reached across the space between their chairs to take Silas's hand, their fingers intertwining with the comfortable familiarity of people who had learned to lean on each other. "We're bearing fruit," she corrected gently. "All of us together, Thomas's memory, your commitment, my determination, and this beautiful boy who represents our combined hopes." As if summoned by their attention, Thomas Samuel chose that moment to roll over for the first time, his chubby face lighting up with delight at his own accomplishment. Both adults rushed to praise this milestone, their voices mixing in the kind of joyful chaos that marked homes where children were treasured and celebrated. Later, as afternoon shadows lengthened across the ranch land that Thomas's sacrifice had helped preserve, the three of them would visit the cemetery together. Clara would place fresh flowers on her husband's grave, while Silas held the baby, and they would share the week's news with the man whose death had brought them together and whose memory continued to bless their lives. The photograph on the mantel would gain company over time, images of first steps, birthday celebrations, Christmas mornings, and all the ordinary miracles that marked a family's journey through joy and sorrow toward whatever future awaited them. But this first portrait would always hold special meaning as the moment when three hearts damaged by loss discovered they could heal together, creating something beautiful and lasting from the broken pieces of their separate griefs. Thomas Samuel gurgled contentment from his cradle, wrapped in the blue blanket that had welcomed him into a world where love was stronger than loss and where second chances bloomed like prairie flowers after the hardest winters.